idea of justice, even if it differs from state to state, essentially it doesn't just hold in the idea of restitution, right? You've got other factors such as rehabilitation and protecting victims' justice. We tell you that only under our case can all these pillars of justice actually stand, right? I'll tell you all this in my rebuttal, but before that, let's take a look at what I've got to tell the House in today's debate, right? I've got 3 arguments to give to you. Firstly, I'll talk to you about how rehabilitation is best under our case. Secondly, I'll talk to you about how you have to strengthen the idea of deterrence and essentially removing a lot of factors of deterrence. But the last argument and the most important argument would be why it's important for state to maintain the hierarchy of power when it comes to law, and why they have to maintain the idea of them having the last say and not getting civilian society letting them do that, right? But before that, rebuttal, right? The mechanism is still something we have a problem with, something Sharia tried to clarify, but still has not clarified, right? We tell you that essentially, families can go up on the witness benches, but it's not just that. Families can hire lawyers for prosecution. Families can go up there and cry and try to convince the audience as much as they can, right? They can get involved inside the system as much as they can, right? But we tell you that society essentially is also involved in the case. Because when it comes to a murder, and this was actually my first speaker, it's not just about the direct effects of losing a family, but the harm and the traumatization that I go through that know that a killer is amongst me, right? And essentially when a family so individually says that I pardon them, right? What's the effects to a society which is officially traumatized forever by this one person, and knowing that he still lives among our midst just because the family can forgive him, but what about me who can never forgive something like that, right? But we tell you also that we're not disallowing you to forgive the family. Sit down, Sharif, I'll forgive you in a minute. We're not disallowing you to become empathetic. Do that, fine. But it's important for state to always go out with a punishment. Why? Because number one, we tell you that we never allow ideas like vigilante justice. Taking justice into your own hands and judging it by your own rules. The state always has to be consistent by their ideas of justice, and that's why we need a neutral body to do it. That's why you have courts, judges, and all the lawyers and everything like that. But essentially, we tell you that when you go against the law, you're not just going against the family. Essentially, you've broken the idea of a social contract, which everybody has signed. You promise not to kill anyone, so nobody will kill you, right? So we tell you essentially, families shouldn't have the ultimate say. They shouldn't even have a majority of say. Rather, the state should be equal amongst the law, amongst the system, amongst the state, and amongst society as a whole, right? We don't see a problem in that. But we tell you again, how will these victims then get suddenly really, really sad because this person didn't get punished, right? We tell you, even if you can forgive them, and you can forgive them, you wouldn't become like distressed because this person got the punishment that he deserved. Because we told you that courts don't just brutally give out sentences. We told you that they go through a lengthy court process, and I wouldn't be distressed even if I forgive, but this person has to go through anyway, right? So and the idea of a trial is that even if the jury pardons you, you still have to give justification towards why you punish them, or why you let them go, why you give the sentence that you gave. Right? We tell you, it doesn't necessarily have to be the family, and we don't understand why you have to be directly involved in the situation for you to be part of the situation. Because essentially, you can read up on it, you can feel the same feelings, and it's not mutually exclusive. Everything they try to propagate to you. Sharif, yes.
Tell me why the government has to compensate more for society than the people who are actually affected.
We tell you no, because society always has to compensate the family most. Yes, we believe that. But we don't see how even if I forgive, suddenly I'm not compensated. Because essentially law works as a consistent and neutral body, and not just to cater to certain parties and stuff like that. Right? We still allow you to forgive, just not to let them off scot-free. Let's look at the idea of rehabilitation. Right? To tell you that essentially this argument, by the way, is a huge chunk of the pillar of justice which we are trying to maintain. Right? Essentially, you have to allow these people to always go through the best amount of rehabilitation. And if 20 years was the sentence, then 20 years so be it. So we say even if you have rehabilitated after 5 years, you still have to serve through those 20 years. And there's reasons why you have to do that. Number one, you don't want to undermine the lengthy court process and the huge amount of money and time and energy that has gone to deciding a sentence in the first place. But secondly, we tell you, you always have to respect the final say of the court of justice. And essentially, they are the ones who represent all layers of society now. All layers of society and always have the most fair say, right? But we tell you that essentially when you take down all punishment, and rehabilitation is the only thing they're looking for, then we tell you that the whole idea of justice is different then. Put them in a jail, and as long as they have remorse, we let them out whenever that ends, right? We tell you no. Justice always gives you a time which you have to serve, and essentially that's the time you have to serve to compensate for everything that you did. Right? But let's look at the second idea, the idea of deterrence. Murderers wrong to do it, or whatever, they can now get scot-free and run away from the situation. The fact is, even if you were coerced into a condition, state always is consistent against murder. Even if you did, even if you were just accessory to the murder, you still get charged for things like manslaughter, right? We tell you that number one, state always has to be consistent in the stance against the idea of murderer. But secondly, we tell you that you don't want to open the gateway to abuse. How essentially I can just gain pity from the family, and because you have majority of votes, I can get away scot-free. You make murder and almost legitimize it in a way, in their case, something we don't want to happen. But our final argument is how state always has to be in control of the law. And essentially, it's always about state taking a neutral body. You never allow, even if you're going to sentence that person to death, you never allow me to shoot that person like that, right? Because the state always has to act as the arbiter, the moral, and the arbiter of law, right? It's essential for states to maintain this position and for you to almost gain an idea of immunity, because what we say is the one that's best for society and is the one that's right, right? Because essentially what we've told you is we still allow families to go through the idea of catharsis that they want, right? You can still forgive and forget and do whatever you want. But the idea of state is you look at a bigger picture than that. You look at how it affects majority and how you have to not tolerate the idea of vigilante justice. At the end of the day, we think that we have to be the people who hold on to the law, and not just anybody who got affected, especially if it's people who are emotional, in distress, and can't make a mental, a rational decision in the first place. And with all those reasons, we're proud to propose out of that.